Hello, we are back with Reimagining Memory, historical and fantasy fiction. We're really excited about this one. When we first started really conceiving of Words and Music 2020, we were thinking about ways that memory works and how memory works within our city. And we were thinking about historical fiction, and we said, we've got to do something cool with this. And then our brilliant steering committee member, Matthew Smith, said, well, both of these genres, historical fiction and fantasy fiction, really call upon imaginative powers and speculation. And it revises and tweaks and exoticizes the past. And so does a lot of fantasy. So let's talk about how these two genres that are usually considered sort of opposite things might work together. So here we are doing that. And when we started thinking about the moderator for this session, there was one person. And it is the person who is the brains behind not only the tech at this festival, but also the wonderful Tubby and Coo's Mid-City Bookshop. Now, Tubby and Coo's, I was actually advised to go to right after it opened from a friend, Nicole. And she said, hey, you like books. My sister owns a bookstore. They just opened. You should go. And I walked in, and there's stairs painted like books. There's games. I don't know how Candice did it, but they created magic in that space. And I'm so excited for the magic that is to come at their new location, which will open soon. So everyone go to Tubby and Coo's when it reopens. Also, you can show them some love by visiting our virtual festival bookstore powered by Tubby and Coo's. Not only can you support a local independent bookseller, but you can also support the festival because 10% of the proceeds are being generously donated to us. I cannot say enough good things about Candice Huber. They are generous and warm, and they put up with my nonsense when my brain doesn't work. And not only do they run Tubby and Coo's, they have game nights, they have author talks, they have animals, they're a wife. I don't know how they do it all. I really don't. So to introduce you on screen for the first time during this festival, from behind the scenes, Candice Huber, y'all. Give it up.
Thank you, Megan. And now I'm going to be crying after that introduction for this panel. So that was a lot, but thank you. That was beautiful. And yes, I've been behind the scenes this whole time watching everything, which has been amazing. I'm so lucky to be here, and I'm really excited for this conversation today with three authors that are some of my favorite local authors. And so let's get started with them. So today we're talking about historical and fantasy fiction, history, fantasy, how it all intersects. And today I have Alys Arden, who is a French Quarter person. She's born and raised there by street performers. And she has also split between here and New York City. She has a marketing background. Her debut novel garnered over 1 million reads online before it was acquired. She writes the Casket Girls series, which the 4th book is coming out in January. And she also has a graphic novel, Zatanna, The Jewel of Gravesend, which will be released in April. So 2 books coming out next year. Hi, Alys. Thank you for being here. I also have Marita Crandle, who is the author of a bunch of local books, actually nonfiction books, my favorite being New Orleans Vampires, but she also has one on Storyville and Josie Arlington, and she has one on Johnny White's, and quite a few local books now. And I know that she's working on some historical fiction as well, which I'm really excited to read. She owns Boutique du Vampire in the French Quarter, and also Potions Bar, which is one of my favorite places. We've had our Harry Potter parties there in the past. And she is a transplant from Germany, also has a marketing background, and is another person, all three of these people, really, I don't know how they do everything that they do. So welcome, Marita.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you so much.
And last but not least, I have Daniel Jose Older, who is a New York Times best-selling author. He's got a lot of books, but of course the Bone Street Roomba urban fantasy series, the Book of Lost Saints, which was really good. He has the Dactyl Hill Squad, which is a middle grade historical fantasy series that puts dinosaurs and history together. And I'm excited to hear him talk about that today. He writes for Star Wars. He wrote, Shadow Shaper, that series was amazing. So he is prolific and award-winning, and I'm so excited to have him here today as well. So welcome, Daniel.
Great to be here.
So I want to start here with everyone sort of just introducing the audience to your work and how you incorporate history and fantasy, like fantastical or supernatural elements, into what you do. So Alys, you want to start us off?
Sure. So the Casket Girls is urban fantasy. So I think one of the ways that, and it's about different New Orleans urban legends. So as the title suggests, the first book is about 3 of the vampire urban legends in the French Quarter. And the book kind of asks, what if these legends were tied together through time? Because they don't actually take place in the same time. So they would be connected through their different centuries. So history is the mechanism that explains a lot of the fantasy in the story, and thus making it feel more real, which to me is always good in urban fantasy. Like, I like urban fantasy that feels as real as possible. Of course, I love epic fantasy and high fantasy and all of that, but I think my number one is urban fantasy. And my favorite, is when readers send me messages that are like, I know this sounds so crazy because there's like vampires in your book, but like, I really just feel like it really happened. And I think one of the major attributes to that, isn't brilliant writing. It's the fact that so many of the things are supported by history. So I think that's one of the ways. The second way is probably just rewriting history to some degree. So one of the big things, and this isn't really a spoiler, you find out somewhat right away. And I don't really know why I had the gall to do this, but I kind of rewrite Medician history, or like the fall of the Medician dynasty in the series. And it kind of is like, well, what if it wasn't syphilis that took them down and it was a vampire? So kind of let them live on, into the present day and possibly for eternity. So I think those are the 2 ways, like something that's very macro across the series and across the genre, and then something that is much more specific.
Awesome. And Daniel, what about you? I see you drinking out of that banned books mug, I think. I have the same exact mug. And I'm like,
great
yes.
mug. I love it.
It's amazing.
It's so cool. I can't remember where I got it. I feel like I donated somewhere and they sent it.
It is Unemployed Philosophers Guild, I want to say, or something like that. Anyway,
yes, totally. I love all that, Alys, and it's so cool that it's in your work. And I feel the same way, like for me, whether I'm writing actual historical fantasy or just ghost stories, it's always about the crossroads of mythology and history. And I think that's such a right place to explore, because all history really is mythology and all mythology really is history, but we treat them as if they're in these 2 separate categories and they can't interact. Otherwise we're lying. And it's that type of myth that's a lie, right? As opposed to the myth that's a cool story about monsters. And I find that so interesting. I find these categories that we make very fascinating and very telling about who we are kind of as a people, and also very damaging if we don't treat them, as the categories that they are, and if we take them to be reality. By which I mean, there's more about history that we don't know than that we do know. But we act like we do know, and we're taught history. People teach history as if it's these straightforward, simple truths, and then, discovery of America and all these lies that are really about genocide, that are really about horrible things that happened and horrible things that people have done. And how do we craft it to make it sound more okay so that we can keep going, right? And keep doing it over and over. And that's why it's so dangerous. And that's also why, for writers, it's such an interesting place to intervene and to step in and say, yes, but what if? And what about those histories that white supremacy has destroyed or tried to erase or pretends that never happened, right? What about those people that were buried underneath all the real realms of lies that, you know, we've been telling ourselves? And that's, again, where there's so much to uncover. There are histories that have made it through. And when we start to do research, we can find them, and it's so cool. And then we can add pterodactyls and like ride into war, you know, on a dactyl back, and how cool that is. And that's where the nerd in me just gets really excited, the fantasy nerd from back when I was a kid, and still, you know, just lights up. So with Dactyl Hill Squad, like, I wasn't that interested in writing a straightforward historical fiction book, not because I don't like those, I love those, but my brain really gets excited by fantasy. So I had all this research in my head about the Civil War era and New York specifically, and different activists of color who fought back in different ways. And I didn't know where to put it until I was like, what if they could ride on pterodactyls? And then it all made sense. And the whole
Clearly the tie that binds.
What's that?
Clearly the tie that binds.
I feel like every writer has to ask themselves that question at some point. And that's how Dactyl Hill happened.
And it's awesome. If y'all have kids in middle grade, please read the Dactyl Hill Squad. Get them to read it because it's so good. I enjoyed it so much.
There is actually a video game on the Scholastic website that you can play flying around as Magdalise on the back of a pterodactyl dodging Tyrannosauruses in 1863 New York. It's really cool.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. That's really cool.
The books or the series end in New Orleans or in Louisiana?
Yeah, and then these two books end up in New Orleans. So they end up down in the swamplands for a little bit, and then they're in New Orleans proper for a good chunk of the third book, and into Mexico. It's a whole New Orleans. I mean, it had to, right? Like, there's so much history here.
And Marita, what about you? Because you write a lot of real history. I think every published book you have so far has been nonfiction, but I know you're working on historical fiction. So you kind of have a unique perspective.
Well, it kind of happened backwards. So I had an idea to write a story about the Carter brothers, which is one of our vampire legends here in the French Quarter. And then just miraculously, History Press contacted me and asked if I would submit a proposal to write a book about where the vampire legends of the French Quarter came from. And I thought, wow, this is too good to be true. So they accepted my proposal, and I wrote that book, and I learned so much that I started getting really intrigued about really incorporating or finding out more of the history. And so my book I'm really supposed to be talking about is the Josie Henderson book. And that is, she was a madam here during Storyville time. Mm. And I think the research for me is the best part, because I uncover things that, you know, so many people don't know about. Like there was a prison here on just across Canal Street that was everything, you know, back in the past. They had the chambers there for the judges. They had a chapel. They had the cells for women. They had cells for men. And it was only there for like 40 years, but it was there during Storyville time. And so I just uncovered so many interesting things about that I was able to incorporate into my novel. And so that's really what I've been doing more of, is finding out the little tidbits of history that people wouldn't necessarily know about, and trying to incorporate those so that when they do read the novel and something comes up and then they do some research and they'll go, wow, this is real. Because I know when I read historical fiction, I love that. When I do some research afterwards and I'm like, wow, this really happened. And she just incorporated, you know, her characters. So that's kind of my take on, or what I'm doing with my books.
Awesome. Alys, do you have something to add?
Yeah, to build on that a little bit, I think that's one of, like, bringing it back to New Orleans, like, because the city is so unique, it is the historical, you know, those lesser known historical things, or not even that far back into history. I think one of the things about the Casket Girls that makes people write to me with that it feels so real is those small things that they don't think are real, but then they look them up and they find out that it is.
Right.
On top of crazy shit that happened after Katrina that they also think I made up. Yeah. And then they go to look up and then it's real. So then it does start to be like, well, wait, is the magic stuff real too? Like, if all of that other stuff that I thought you made up was real, is this stuff also real? And you're really like blurring those lines. And I think that is like where the magic starts to happen.
And to the point, to Marita's point, and that too, it's like, it's like when you start to study history a little more deeply than what they kind of shove down our throats. It's like there's so much cool stuff in there, and it almost makes it worse when then you watch like really plain, boring, derivative historical fiction that doesn't do anything with any of that cool shit. And you're like, but it was right there. Like, why would you do something bland and like overdone when there was amazing stories with layers and complex characters and all kinds of Shakespearean shit, and you wanted to go neutral? Like, it just makes me even more mad. But I wanted to show this real quick because they made a map of the French Quarter with dinosaurs for the third Dr. Hirschsprung book, and it's so cool, and I just love it.
That's
so much.
really cool.
Yeah,
It's very cool. And I think that, you know, of course, New Orleans lends itself to a lot of this as well, because, you know, if things like vampires and dinosaurs would happen, it would probably be here. So I think, yeah, like as a setting, I think New Orleans sort of lends itself to bringing together history and the supernatural or fantasy or whatever. And all of you have books set here. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well. Do you think New Orleans lends itself to that more than other settings that you could have picked?
For me,
go ahead, I'm sorry. For me, definitely, you know, actually the French Quarter has such a magical place in my heart. And I think probably for all of us, so many people have that story that when they set foot into the French Quarter, they were just, you know, gravitated here. And that happened to me. I came here and I thought, I couldn't believe it existed. Ended up selling my house over the phone and moving here. And I mean, I just, you know, there's so much history. We don't just have vampire history. We have storybook history. We have poets, we have witches. We have, you know, so much. It's such a rich culture. And then we have voodoo, and we have just even the, you know, Black culture into novels. And there's just, it's almost, it makes your head swirl how much history we have here to work with.
Yes. It's the same for me. I you know, I'm a transplant, and I first came here when I was a teenager, driving across country, and totally fell in love. And I was really set on San Francisco, but I very nearly stayed here since I was 18. And I knew I would come back. It took me 20 years to get back to live, but I was visiting throughout, and it's just a place that I've always loved, and I always felt loved by every time I come. And then as a northerner, like, it does feel like there are dinosaurs here, like, you know, because all we have is like chickadees, you know what I mean? And then you show up, and pigeons, and then you show up here and it's like storks and like lizards and all kinds of creatures and bugs that are like bigger than some of the birds. Like, it, you know, that's just my memory of when I would go to visit my tios in Miami too. Like, anytime you kind of like get below the Mason-Dixon line, nature gets a lot more interesting. And when you're from Boston, that feels like a prehistoric era in terms of like science. Like, it's so cool seeing lizards. I'm still that little kid, because I still walk outside my house and I'm like, lizards, you know, like, that's dinosaurs for us, you know what I mean? Like the crows, all that. So it's that. The other piece was, I was telling the story on Twitter the other day, because the first time I came here, that first trip, I was having, you guys remember Mr. Gyro's? It was on Decatur.
Yeah.
It was a really good Greek restaurant in the Quarter way back. This was 98. And I was eating there with a stripper, and we were just hanging out. You know, you just meet random people. And she was like, I'm a witch. And I was like, can you do some magic for me? Because I was 18. And she was like, yeah, what do you want me to do? And I was like, can you make it rain? Because it was a cloudless night, and I hadn't seen rain for a while. I wasn't trying to be a jerk, you know. And she was like, I'll see what I can do. And then I kind of wandered off into the night, and I wandered into the Quarter. And sure enough, I look up, and there are these cranes above the Quarter with sticks attached to them dangling in the air, and there's water pouring down from them. And it's because they were filming the movie Double Jeopardy with Ashley Judd, and they were doing a rainy scene where there was a chase happening in the Quarter. And I was like, oh, and I like ran over to it, and I was in the race, and I was 18 and having a moment, and I was like in the background of the shot, you know. And it's like, that's practical magic, and that's what happens in New Orleans every day. And that's always felt very like also normal to me, you know what I mean? So like, being here, it's like it all makes sense finally, instead of it being like this aberration or this weird thing that's out there somewhere.
For sure. And I want to talk about, and y'all, I'm glad that y'all like sort of brought things up that I want to talk about, which is really, really cool. So I definitely want to talk about your research processes a little bit, because, you know, all of you write, you know, kind of really mesh together well, the myths or the fantastical and the real history. And as y'all were saying, I think in all of your books, like Marita writes nonfiction, but you would think it's made up a lot of the times. And Daniel and Alys write fiction, and it does. It makes you like look stuff up. Like, wait, is this real? And that line is blurred. So I'm interested in your research process, and what things have you found, like in your research processes too, for this stuff that like seem not real, but they're real, right? Like it's so outrageous that you would think it's fiction, but it's not. I don't know if y'all have any like fun facts like that. But if not, just tell us about your research processes, because I'm interested on that.
I'm sure there are a million things that I'm not going to be able to think of off the top of my head. I never know like how deep or shallow to answer this question, because I feel like what I'm saying is boring, but then it's a question that people always ask, so people must be interested in it.
Go deep.
What?
Go deep.
Yeah. My research process is very extensive and very thorough. I think especially because, I mean, this is definitely building off of what Daniel was saying, but there is so much revisionist history that if you're really like getting into a complex, nuanced, layered story, you're not like going to Wikipedia or Googling, you are going to libraries, you are going to the research center, you are becoming best friends with the guys that work at the New Orleans Historic Center. Like this week, I got my manuscript back from both a voodoo priestess and the Archdiocese of New Orleans. So you're writing some New Orleans shit when you're getting it, So I have gone to Florence for a few weeks to study the Medici and work with private tours. And I have really complex systems of keeping up with everything and color coding things. And I think one of the great things about it is when you're going so deeply into certain topics, it's all stuff that I'm interested in regardless of this story. So, and for example, in the Romeo Catcher, so each story has its own historical plot line. So in book 1, it starts in Paris and it's the transatlantic journey, like coming to colonial New Orleans with a stop in Saint-Domingue. And in book 2, it's in like a little post-Renaissance Florence. And there was one big scene, but it was kind of crucial to the character's development in the story about like medical science of the time. So when I was writing this book, I knew pretty much everything there was to know about science and surgery and what human beings knew about the body and what they believed falsely about the body, from this 50-year period. And there was one point where I actually had to change the timeline by about 20 years. And 20 years in science back then, in medical science, it's like it might as well have been 500 years. I had to rewrite the whole thing. And it ended up being about the discovery of a vein, which for a vampire book actually was much better than whatever it had been. But because some people I could see very easily being like, you spend way too much time on this. Like, this is not productive. This is why you write so slow. But the thing is now, several years later, I still have all of that inside of me. And I totally know that my next project is now going to involve like historical medicine. And I am super excited about where this is going to go and what the series is potentially going to do. And I know I never would have gone down, I wouldn't be going down this path right now if I hadn't gone down so deeply for the Romeo Catchers. And I also just don't believe that it would have been so rich if I hadn't gone down so deeply there. But I mean, it's really not until you start peeling back these layers, that you're finding these other figures in history, you know, that are not the wealthy white man who had the right last name, you know, who either wrote the books or was the best friend or the son of or the boss of or whatever, you know, of the person who wrote the books.
Right.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong necessarily with those, but it's like those are stories I'm just not interested in, you know, as a reader or a writer. So I'm, you know, ecstatic to take the time to find something else, more or less. But like Daniel said, it's like, especially in a city like New Orleans, it's just laziness if that's where you're landing, because it doesn't take a lot of work to get to some cool stuff. I mean, some stuff is incredibly hard, I find, for research because of how much history has been destroyed. But I at least like to feel like I have exhausted the resources that I have available to me before I start making stuff up to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. I think of research. I think of my research process in a funnel shape, and it starts very, very broad. Sometimes it starts before I realize I'm doing the research. So like for Dactyl Hill Squad, I watched the entire Ken Burns Civil War series at one point, and I had no idea why. All of a sudden, I was just like, I need all this information about the Civil War, right? But I followed my gut, and that's one thing that you have to do as a writer a lot, is learn how to follow your gut. Yeah. Even though at the time I had no projects on the table with that had to do with that whatsoever, I just got really interested in it. So I find it really helpful to have an overview and a bird's eye view of things, and that's what documentaries like that do. They take you from the beginning to the end, and just give you this really broad spectrum, and then I stayed broad after I realized that I was actually going to cover that period for real. I still needed more kind of broad stuff. So I read Battle Cry of Freedom, the James McPherson book, because that's exactly that. It really just gets into, it's beautifully written, and it just gets into so many different aspects of it throughout the course of the war. And as I was doing that, I realized like I really only cared about the last 2 years, because that's when things got really interesting to me. And again, I was paying attention to my instincts. And that's when, they put Grant in charge. That's when the Union got its shit together and started winning battles finally, instead of fucking around and pretending that they were just here for kicks or whatever. And is this the kids panel? Not anymore.
No.
so again, I was starting to zero in, right? Last 2 years of the war. And then I was like, well, what about, and then I already had some information stored up about the draft riots. So learning about New York. So again, I'm just zeroing in. I will say that, and this is going to make a lot of librarians cringe, I realize, but Wikipedia can be very helpful in an early stage of research. It can't be the end-all be-all, and you can't use it as a reference on your papers, kids. But it is super helpful in that there's a lot of great information on there, and it will lead you to a lot of even better information. And if you treat it that way, it's super good. If you treat it as the truth, the answer and everything else, that's going to do you harm and your story harm. But the cross-referencing ability, you can just go, you can get lost, like going from battle to battle to general, biography to this, to that. And that's a really helpful thing, like, because there's two modes of research. There's like the wandering, kind of the fool that wanders, which is great. You should be a fool sometimes. And then there's the precision, the surgeon who's like, okay, now we need to get right to the exact point so we can extract the information we need and get on with it. And those are different kinds of hats. Those are different kinds of reading. And it's important that you know what you're doing, because sometimes you'll pop up, you'll have to pop in and out of them at different times. You can be deep in a series and suddenly be like, wait, I need to do some wandering again, and then kind of come back in and hone in on what you're looking for.
Oh yeah, if I hadn't had Wikipedia, like purely for the Medici family tree.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's clutch. Exactly. And then for Star Wars, they have the Wikipedia, which is also incredibly helpful, and I have used quite a bit.
Thank you for calling Cubby and Coos.
Give me 1 second, Mike.
We are currently closed for browsing due to COVID-19. However,
sorry, I'm not sure I can do anything about my answering machine at the bookstore, but I'll mute myself so that Marita can talk about her research process.
So, yeah, like Alys, I get carried away with it, and like you as well. What I do, which is kind of crazy, I was happy once I finished the vampire book that I could go back to my Carter Brothers novel, because now I had all this information from the past to incorporate into the novel. And then I needed a character to have a love affair with Wayne Carter. And I thought, it'd be really cool if she was a madam. And so I started researching madams, and all of a sudden I found Josie Arlington, And I was just amazed by her. So I had to know more. So the more research I did, I thought, gosh, this would make a great history book as well. So instead of finishing my vampire book, I wrote another history book on Josie Arlington. But I mean, I'm really glad I did, because I found out things that I never would have gone to the lengths to find out. And I mean, like you said, there's so many crazy, things that really happened that we could never believe. And I mean, even like, the history of New Orleans, a lot of people know about Gallant Street, but I mean, a lot of people don't. They think Storyville was the end all to, brothels, where before that, there were two predecessors, Gallant Street and the Swamp. And I thought, wow, this is so, so the more you know, the more you can actually add your fiction on top of that, layer it. But one thing that I found was really cool. So I was doing research on the Carter Brothers novel again, and I was doing a lot of research on blood, and I wanted to find something unique. And so this is so fascinating to me that this is really true. Back in the World War II, they were using, they'd already learned how to separate blood, and they had it to a powder form, which they use nowadays. And I actually had a customer come into my vampire shop to tell me this, and that's why I started researching it, because he's a phlebotomist. He said, yeah, sometimes a patient will have so much blood coming out of them that doctors take a handful of this powdered blood and throw it on their wounds, because it's the easiest way to stop the bleeding. And so I researched it, and they were already doing that in World War II, so they could get soldiers back to where they could actually be, worked on, rather than just the fields. And so I really incorporated that into my novel as a way for the kind of vampire huntress to keep the vampires at bay, because it kind of freezes them for the moment, right? So anyway, things like that, though, that you find out are true, it's so fun to incorporate into your work.
So I thought of something specific, but it's not like a wacky kind of thing, and it's a bit opposite as far as it was something that I found interesting, and I didn't believe it. So I had to look it up, and it honestly is what started the whole book. So I will keep this succinct as possible. So around the time when I was, kind of starting to write, I met a family member of mine who was my grandfather's cousin. So it was a woman in her 80s, and she was the coolest person I had ever met in my family. I was like, who are you? Like how? And she is a nun. She still is a nun. She's a Jubilee Ursuline nun. And I just could not believe that someone so cool was also a nun. Like, I will say it. And it made me want to learn more about the Ursulines and more about being a nun. And she very much told me that becoming a nun could be an act of feminism, and especially in 14th century, 15th century. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, that is so not true, and it goes back to like my biases and what I had thought about nunneries, convents, being a nun, clergy, all of that, from my experiences growing up in Catholic New Orleans. And so I was happy to be proven wrong, or like wrong in this case, because I really did think she was just so great and so progressive and so feminist. So I had to go and learn more. So I started reading everything that was written pretty much academically on the Ursulines, their role in colonial New Orleans, which is not totally unproblematic. And, how they got here, why they came, and then further back in Europe. And it didn't take a ton of work to discover that women sometimes really did join convents as an act of feminism, because if you were a nun, you answered to God and you did not answer to man. And I was like, damn, like I would have, like, I had to be proven wrong. I had to read like 6 dense academic tomes to discover this information, because to me that was wacky, like that was crazy. And I found that so fascinating that I just kept digging deeper and deeper. And then of course, at the same time, I was taking a science fiction and fantasy workshop, and everyone in the class like absolutely hated Twilight. Like it was cool to hate YA, to hate vampires, to hate especially Stephanie Meyer. And at the time, I was not in the writing world. I could not understand how adults hated someone so much, or like hated a writer so much. So, and I wasn't really like popular in this class because I didn't know like every Wikipedia entry. So I was like, well, I'm going to write a YA vampire book. And I happened at that exact time to have been doing all of this research just for my personal like knowledge on the Ursulines. And it just happened that, oh, well, there's this vampire urban legend that takes place in the Ursuline convent. And then, you know, I needed to apparently write thousands of pages. So.
That's actually a little bit like it's similar. My origin story for Dr. Hill Squad was researching. I was writing a rock opera about Crow Hill, which as one does. With the Brooklyn Historical Society gave me a grant to write a rock opera, which is really cool. It was to go into their archive, which is this very cool Hogwartsian building downtown, and has all this amazing information and documents from all throughout Brooklyn history. So I zeroed in on Crow Hill, and I was writing about that time period and basically the Civil War era, and it led me to learn about the Colored Orphan Asylum, which was in Midtown Manhattan, and was burned down in the draft riots. And in researching that, I came upon this group of Cuban sisters that were dropped off there as kids for several months and then whisked away again mysteriously and kind of disappeared from history. And it just jumped out at me as a Cuban to have that moment of being like, oh, Cubans in New York in the 1830s, like what? Totally blew my mind, which is a moment that I had separately, you know, with fantasy and science fiction, not finding myself in those genres and then being able to find them in different ways suddenly. It's such a revelation. So it really jumped out, you know, and those were the people who I originally was like, what if they got away? What if they like took off into the New York streets and had adventures instead of being taken back probably to a plantation in Cuba? You know, what is their survival story? And then what if there were pterodactyls involved? And everything really, that's where everything came from. So it was that moment of recognition of this lost history, and then having to rely on imagination, which is where the fantasy piece comes in. Because it's like, if you're going to make up stories that we don't know whether or not they happen, then why not jump in with some even more like extraness to make it really fun too.
You know, one thing I wanted to say real quick about the research is that what I really want to get to the bottom of things, and I know Elise does this too, and I found that when you even read famous people's books, you know, about history, they'll say something, and I'll think, well, what's their facts? And, you know, they'll just say it and not have an actual fact of what it was. And so I look in the footnotes a lot, and you find out a lot of stuff in footnotes, but I won't stop until I find out where the actual first, you know, thing came from. So like, for instance, with the Casket Girls, I had to know the first time they were called the Casket Girls. And it took me a while to find that out, but it was worth every minute of it. And it's fascinating, all the other things you find out, you know, but really definitely footnotes and doing it and research to really get to the end of the very bottom of it.
So well, now I'm curious as to what this is. Where do we hear the Casket Girls for the first time?
Well, I want to add this because this is something that Marita and I have talked about at length, and we've talked about at length with historians in New Orleans as well. And this is something that I definitely didn't know to the degree. So if you are a historical fiction writer or you want to be a historical fiction writer, this is something very important to know. So much is wrong because of this. So back in the day, you know, before the internet and, you know, easy forms of mass media, one person would write something, right? And then there were no like academic journals, and, you know, it had to be presented so many times before it came fact, you know, or anything like that. And it's like, one person would write something, and then another person would write something and quote that. And then once it became quoted once, it was like fact. And things spread like wildfire. You know, so whether that person was bias, whether that person was just wrong, whether they just misunderstood something, whether it was a freaking typo, you know, or like not typo, but like handwriting that couldn't be interpreted. And actually that was a big thing of like handwriting being misinterpreted into something else. So it's why like in New Orleans history that, and even going with specifically the Casket Girls history of the legend and the different components of it, you're going for any sort of accuracy, you have to exhaust like every resource, and even stuff that you would think is, you know, absolutely correct. You're in the archives at the archdiocese, you know, or something like that. It's like, no, you can easily find like 18 sources that say that, and you think that it's correct because of 18. But if you dig deep enough, they are all quoting the same wrong. So, and I think especially topics like voodoo or anything where like ethnographers were the original sourcers of the material or like documenters of the material, it's like,
that's so interesting. And you know, that's one thing that I want to talk about, because this also keeps coming up over and over in this conversation, is who gets to tell this history, right? Because in so many situations, the sources that you're going to for research are, like you said, they're either wrong or they're written by, you know, white people, and they are not 100% correct. And I think some of the power in writing about history or using history in your writing is the ability to sort of correct it in your own way, or to revise it, or to, you know, just show people that like maybe this isn't exactly, like maybe it's not exactly what you learned in school or whatever. So I want to hear y'all's thoughts on that, and in your own writing, like what are your goals with that? Or like, do you ever think about that? Like, okay, I want to tell this story. Like, I know for Daniel, you said like you found this about these Cuban kids and you're like, this is the story that I want to tell because it's not told. And I think there's so much power in that. And that's how we get these stories that are so intertwined with real history. And then you add dinosaurs and everyone's like, yes, you know, like.
I think for me, it's very specifically too about, you know, like when we talk about, when we teach writing and everything, like the one thing that the protagonist absolutely has to be is active, whether that is mentally active or, you know, emotionally active. They have to take action somehow to do something. They cannot just sit and watch shit happen, right? And for so long, the way that white supremacy has taught us about how this country works is that people of color are either bad and need to be eliminated, or they need to be saved. And, you know, the way that the Civil War history is taught, the way that slavery is taught, you know, even when it's from a liberal point of view, it very often regulates Black people and people of color into these roles where there's no action that gets to be taken, that they take. And that is not true. That's not what happened in history, obviously, but also like on record too. The moment for me where that really jumped out was learning about David Ruggles, who was an incredible activist in New York, who was part of the Underground Railroad and really got the organizing world together around getting people who had escaped from slavery to safety, which included getting them out of New York, because New York wasn't safe. People were kidnapping Black New Yorkers and sending them back into slavery, and those people worked for the government, you know, so it wasn't like this peaceful, you know, happy place for people who had escaped slavery, or for Black people who hadn't escaped slavery, because they could just as easily be sold down south.
Yeah, Hudson River Valley slaves.
What's that? Hold on.
I've been doing a lot of research on River Valley lately, and even after living in New York for over a decade, I feel like I'm just starting to learn about the history of slavery there. And I feel like that's just one of those examples that you learn in school, is that slavery only happened in the South.
Exactly. That bullshit, right? So that's a lie that needs to be taken apart, and that people just either were saved or passively let slavery happen to them. David Ruggles took over a boat in New York Harbor that was full of enslaved people and freed them all, and then brought the slavers to be prosecuted, like made citizens arrests at the threat of his own life and was almost kidnapped himself because of it. And these are like, you know, like when we think about like that happening, that's hard to imagine happening today, let alone in a time when slavery, you know, existed and was half of this country at least, but really more. And so acts of heroism like that, I think are on the one hand, just like they need to be honored. We need to like give them their due. And on the other hand, they're inspiring. And, you know, in a time when people are still being pulled off the streets and put in cages, children, and adults, and for no good reason, whether it's because they're on the border or because they're in an urban area where they're criminalized just by existing, we still need to figure out stories of what it means to get free and find out, you know, different ways that people have done that throughout history.
I actually learned about David Ruggles because of Dactyl Hell Squad.
That's why in the back of every book, there's a section that says what is true and what is made up, including about the dinosaurs, which most of it is made up because I just made shit up.
To your question about, you know, do we want to rewrite it? So when I was writing the vampire book, I didn't want to be that person that ruins all the legends. That was, I mean, I really was driven not to do that. So even though I found out all the very, very facts of where the legends came from, I, at the end of, especially the Casket Girl chapter, I kind of rewrote it so that tour guides would have something to go by because, you know, there were so many different versions of it. And I'm really honored that a lot of tour guides are using the book now as a guide because it's more, you know, historically accurate. Because, I mean, there's so many ways you can go with it. So that was fun to, you know, kind of rewrite it. And I added, I mean, some crazy stuff too. But, you know, I tried to make it fun and it's still historical.
Yeah, and I do want to mention if I know that we have maybe 10, 15 minutes left. If anyone has questions, you can drop them in the chat and we'll be happy to address them if you have questions for the panel yourself. I think we sort of answered that one, Megan. But it was one of my questions, so we're on the same wavelength. But I do have a question about making sure readers, or how do you make sure that readers know that you're taking the history seriously? I know that this happens, especially when you're writing about New Orleans, for sure. People here are very protective of our history and our legends. And especially too, when you're writing about the Civil War, for example, that's very serious history. So how do you ensure that your readers know that you're taking it seriously, even though you're adding these fantastical elements like vampires or dinosaurs? I feel like, you know, I don't think any of you do it, but I feel like I've seen writers that it's like, are you taking this seriously, or did you just throw dinosaurs in there because, right? So.
No, that's a really good question because I some of it is, I think there's concrete answers to that question, and there's some of it that's just a vibe, you know, like that you're just like,
sure.
Stuff I read, but it's true. It's true about history, and you're exactly right because of that. Because one thing I love about New Orleans, and one thing that's also true of Boston, actually, is that we take our city and our history of our city deeply, very seriously, and that's cool. And so some of it is like, because we do that, wherever we are, you know, you can just kind of tell when someone isn't, like there's just a way. But I think it's also true, even not in a historical way, but I feel that way a lot reading urban fantasy. A lot of times I'll read urban fantasy, I'm like, this motherfucker's never been in a city.
Right,
like,
nothing to do with
exactly.
right? Like, you live in Connecticut and not New Haven. You know, and that's fine. You can write urban fantasy from Connecticut, but go to New Haven once in a while. You know what I mean? and you can just tell. Some of it is you can just tell. Some of it I think is in the detail work, and it's the details that matter, like the stuff that you would only kind of know if you really immersed yourself in it, whether that's the research or the actual place. And for me, like, I don't think even a lot of people who are history buffs know this, but Grant really did show up in New Orleans, like shortly after winning in Vicksburg, to just kind of like chill for a second. And New Orleans, you know, being this little blue dot, which it kind of still is, in a vast red sea, which was the Confederacy, because of the occupation, was somewhere where he could actually go regroup. He had some strategies he needed to discuss with the folks down here. And he fell off his horse while he was here during a troop inspection. And there was rumors about whether or not it was because he was drunk or whatever, because that was always following him, you know. And it's just this, like, it's to the point of footnotes. It was literally just this footnote in a much larger book. And I was like, oh, that's so perfect, you know. And it's like those little moments that you can pull on. So that actually very much happens in Back to the Hill Squad. And it didn't have to, you know what I mean? But it was one of those things where it's like, this is so cool that this happened, that we never talk about it because it doesn't matter that much, but it's still really cool. You know what I mean? In the grand scheme of like the Civil War, there's a lot of more important details than Grant being in New Orleans for a week and getting so injured that he was actually hobbling around with a massive leg for a while because he broke his leg. His horse fell on him. So, you know, it's a Allosaurus, and its name is Samantha, and they're chasing like Confederate spies through the streets around St. Charles, you know. But again, like I think it's like these moments, it's geography, it's the feeling of being there. You know, it's all these different like visceral details, I think, that really make things come to life, whether it's world building in a fantasy world, in an actual real world thing, or in a historical context.
That's so fun to know that that actually happened.
Yes,
Like, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I didn't think about that being real, but that's awesome.
Like in that moment in history, he was really here, which is so cool.
I would definitely echo all of that. I have a Grant scenario with TCG as well, and it was one of those super tiny footnote sort of things as well. So the whole series, I'm like going through my head and making sure that this is not a spoiler. So if I just stop in the middle, I realize that it is, that I can't say it. But so the series arc is about the legend of the Comte Saint-Germain. And it's an international legend, or like a European legend, really. And then, of course, it has a pit stop in New Orleans, similar to Grant, although that's not my little tidbit. But I have read anything that has been printed about Saint-Germain. And there is some wacky stuff, as Marita
There is.
And it's totally conspiracy theory land, you know. So I spent tons of time before I finished the first book kind of sorting out like what was too far into conspiracy theory land, what is a viable historical avenue, what's like a semi-viable historical avenue. And one of the most like common backgrounds for this man of legend was that he was this Transylvanian prince, and during occupation his father sent him to the Medici, and that he ended up going to school with like one of the younger Medici kids. And that one little sentence, like there's no other details. It might have been that they went to school in Siena, and that's why I put them in school in Siena. But I was like, that's kind of how the Medici came into play. I was writing this whole thing about, or was going to do this whole thing about Saint-Germain, this one tiny little thing that was like, oh yeah, like the Medici hid the prince while the court fled, and he went to school with one of their kids. And so I then ended up, of course, being like, no, this is going to be an alternate history of the Medici legacy. But it was that tiny little footnote, that one little thing that kind of set it off. And of course, that thing does end up being a linchpin in the series. And I won't say any more than that and accidentally say something. But yeah, you get that in book 2. So it's not a big spoiler. But yeah, I think it is about those notes. And I would agree with Daniel. I don't really think that I have a checklist, a mental checklist of like when I'm reading a book, historical or not. I just feel like I do definitely, and setting is so inherent to me that if I am getting those hard vibes of like, have you not even been to a comparable city like the one that you're writing in, much less the city, it's hard probably for me to even finish the book because I can't suspend disbelief. So I feel like it's the same with historical. I do also find that sometimes if I feel like a lot of details are incorrect about certain topics, like even if it's something that's pretty niche, I can't stop my brain from going like, well, I don't even know about all these other things, but I know you're wrong about these things. So are you wrong about all of that as well? Like, should I even be like ingesting this information?
And did you make a choice to be wrong, or are you just lazy?
Right, exactly. And it's why I have a very hard time reading stuff that takes place in New Orleans, because as soon as those like threads in my brain start unraveling, I'm just like, okay, you clearly are wrong about everything, even though you might not be.
Right.
And I haven't thought about that. I think Alys is right. I think people will innately get a feel, like Alys does, for when you're reading a historical book, of how seriously the person took it. I might put something on the back of my book, 2 history books written in research prior to creating the book or something like that. But I don't know. I think it comes out in the writing, how serious the person is about history, like you said.
Yeah, this book I am for the first time really considering putting a historian's note in the back of the book, like Daniel did for Dactyl Hill. We'll see. I didn't do it for any of the other ones because I just felt like it was obvious, the stuff that I had changed.
You would be surprised what people
Right.
think.
But I do feel like it's not just history, of course it is. So the fourth book, as the title of the book suggests, is about a voodoo urban legend in the city, and I do feel like voodoo is one of the most bastardized things, thanks to Hollywood, and just general white supremacy, that it is so unknown, for better and for worse. I think there's also a lot of secrecy on purpose, which I totally respect, and I'm not trying to give away anyone's secrets at all. So I am thinking about it for this book to say to people, I didn't make this stuff up, you just don't know anything, or I definitely made this stuff up over here. So we'll see. It's definitely something that I'm going back and forth with a lot right now. So,
real quick, I just want to get that real quick. Something really interesting I found. I was doing a little research on voodoo, and I found a newspaper article when the newspaper here in New Orleans was still in French, during the time when Marie Laveau was still alive. And it was from a reporter who snuck into a voodoo ceremony of Marie Laveau's. And I translated it, and it's on my website under research. And it was really fun to read. And his take on it, it also was, absurd, but he was actually there, and that was pretty cool. So if you have a chance, check that out. It's really neat.
That is super cool. And we have like 5 minutes left, but there's one question that I really wanted to get to because I'm super interested in this, which is about monsters in history, because I feel like real history has monsters, of course, in it. And I just read P. Jelly Clark's Ring Shout, which if you haven't read it, it's phenomenal. And he makes the KKK are actual literal monsters from hell. And he has these monsters, is amazing. But my question is about monsters in history, because Daniel, in your book, you have both dinosaurs and you have like people monsters, like people are the villains, and they sort of use the dinosaurs as like tools to help them. So I'm really curious as to, and vampires of course are seen as monsters across history. So I'm really curious as to this intersection between like historical monsters, especially like people, white supremacy, things like that, and how you sort of translate that into being like fantastical monsters or supernatural monsters or dinosaurs.
Yeah, for me, it's exactly that. Like dinosaurs don't scare me anymore. Because I'm grown, but I do find the idea of like riding them, or what space they inhabit, what the space they would inhabit in a society if they had survived, is really interesting to think about, just as like a cultural human. But yes, like there was a point in Dactyl Hill when I was trying to figure out who the bad guy would be, because not every book needs a bad guy, but this one really did. It's very much like a children's, like traditional fantasy story in so many ways, and I just really wanted someone evil, and then it just turned out I had to look no further than my own research, because there are so many horrific people. And what really gets me is like when I start to describe this dude whose name I just magically forgot, but that's great, to kids, I'm like, this dude literally has a group called the Kidnappers Club. and he would kidnap Black New Yorkers and sell them into slavery, including children. And it's like, that is some real bad guy from a movie type shit. You know what I mean? Like, who does that? You called your group the Kidnappers Club. It's like, you know how evil you are. Like, you can't, why make up something when it's right there? So that's why I Riker, because there's some controversy about whether or not he's actually the Riker. The Riker's Island is named after, or if he's related to that person. But either way, he might as well be, because that's how he rolled, he was all about putting people in cages, which is what Riker's Island is. So, you know, it's like, it was right there. It was just a question of how do you bring that person into the fabric of the narrative in a way that feels harmonious with the rest of the story. And that was very easy in a way.
And what I thought was interesting is that, of course, he rides the most terrifying dinosaur as well, which was interesting because it was like, oh, the good guys have like, you know, Allosauruses and like all of these sort of benign dinosaurs. And then the bad guys, of course, it's like T-Rex and Velociraptors and stuff. So
I'm going to point out that an Allosaurus will eat your whole life.
Yes, it will. That's true. Yeah. So do y'all have any like final thoughts? This is I think we're at time, but this was amazing. I could talk to y'all all day.
I know we're talking about the past, but I want to shout out my next book, which takes place in the future. It's called Flood City, and it is a middle grade story about kids on the last city on Earth after floods take over.
I'm so excited about that, and it looks like ARCs are available, so I'm gonna email about that.
Lots of monsters.
Awesome. Elise, do you have anything you want to say or
No, this has been great. Thanks for listening. If you're tuning in, you can get the Casket Girls pretty much anywhere in New Orleans, but definitely at Tubby and Coos, and they're probably signed. Each book kind of is a historical journey, but it's pretty much the, you know, New Orleans history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So.
For sure, all of these books are available at Tubby and Coos in our virtual bookstore, and just order from us directly. I for sure have these three authors' books I know in stock right now. So
in closing, I'll say like one thing that's a little positive, because I know we railed a bit, but if you do write historical, I know that I had crippling anxiety before the first book came out because of the history. And did I get every single thing right? Oh my God, am I going to get crucified for getting a small detail wrong? Who was I to rewrite this? And I did go to a lot of talks like this, and I saw other people that were like rewriting way bigger or controversial things than I was doing. And I was like, get a grip. But I will also just say, like, don't let the fear of getting something wrong hold you back. You have to get to the end of the book, and then you can fix details. And even if you get every single thing right, people are going to tell you that you're wrong. Right. I get all the time notes from people or in reviews or whatever that something is in the French Quarter. Like, I got something in the French Quarter wrong. I go look out my door and I'm like, looks right. You know, and then I go and like look up the person and they're like in Wyoming.
Right.
So it's just like, people are going to tell you that you did stuff wrong when you didn't. You're also going to get stuff wrong. Right. Like, perfect. So, you know, just go for whatever you're doing, you know, be as respectful and be as thorough as you can. And also have people read it and their criticism seriously. Yes.
To that point, I had a copy editor try to take bougainvillea out of my book because it doesn't grow in New Orleans. And I was just like, come on over. Let me show you my goddamn house and the bougainvillea that is trying to eat it alive because it's so huge and out of control. But to that point, too, you can always also remember, for writers out there doing historical work, no matter how much you mess it up or get things wrong, it will never be nearly as wrong as most American history textbooks in America. So you're good.
And on that note, I think we will end this panel. I'm going to bring Megan back on. Thank you all so much. This was awesome.
Later.
I'm so glad that I can talk to y'all because it's always awesome. So thank y'all so much for being here. And here's Megan to take us away and move us on. Thanks.
Wow.
Thanks, Candice.
Thank you, guys. So part of my studying for my dissertation was actually theories of history. So I spent a lot of time thinking about storytelling and power and what happens when you control narratives. So this really like sort of took me back to those research phases for my dissertation. I'm so glad that I heard this conversation. So we're going to move on to the next thing. It's actually really interesting that you guys talk so much about research, because the next panel is called Heartbreak and Research, Poets on the Writing Process. So we'll really get to see how poets use their process of research as well, which will be really cool. Don't forget that Words and Music this year is accessible on a donation basis. So whether you give $1 or $1,000, it's all going to the festival, which supports literacy initiatives year-round in New Orleans. So you can do that by clicking those links in the chat. You can also go to PayPal and go to wordsandmusicnola@gmail.com, make a donation there. Or you can go to your phone and text WAM20 to 44321. Don't forget to do a little shopping at Tubby and Coos. The link is in the comments there. You can also go to wordsandmusic.org, and we've got a link up on the homepage of the website as well. We will be back in 6 minutes with Heartbreak and Research, Poets on the Writing Process. I will see